Hi there. This is Greg Sherman, the instructor for your course, EDME 412, and I'm here to conduct a very brief review for the upcoming exam number 2. And so let's dive in and get right to it. First of all, I want to point out that this exam is going to address 3 outcomes similar to exam number 1. It's only going to be measuring the specific outcomes for this part of the course, and there's only 3 of them. The first one is that you should be able to edit poorly worded directions. So that's one important objective that you should be able to do well. The second is that you should be able to edit poorly constructed items, and those can be selected response or constructed response items. And that's editing items that are presented to you, and there may or may not be something that could improve their overall quality based on the guidelines for well-written objectives that was presented in part 2 of the course. And finally, the third objective is that given an instructional objective, you should be able to write selected response and or constructed response assessment items that appropriately measure the skills, knowledge, or attitudes that are indicated within the objectives under any conditions that are stated. And oftentimes there aren't any in an objective, but when they are, then the items need to ensure that they conform to those conditions. So what I'd like to do is present to you some very specific examples, or really a specific example of the kind of items that are going to be measured on the test. And I'm going to pay special attention to something that students have sort of traditionally struggled with on this exam. And that's really going to be the focus of this exam review. So let me just jump right in and point that out to you. First of all, I want to point out that my examples are going to deal with a primary grade objective that addresses something related to time. And here's the objective. Again, this is a primary grade math objective. And the objective is state the time on an analog clock to the nearest 5 minutes. Now, I want to draw your attention to a very important word in this objective, and that is state the time. So, as I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest problems that students have with exam number 2 is that when they go to write items or critique items based on rules, one of the things that kind of gets overlooked is whether or not the item is actually measuring the exact skill that the teacher is trying to get their students to learn how to do. And in this case, if you just look at this item, what it means is that if a child, say 6 or 7 years old, is given a clock, an analog clock, so that means it has hands, they're given a clock, they should be able to tell you what time it is to the nearest 5 minutes, and state the time. So let's take a look at some issues, common issues. Here's an item that somebody might write, which is a short answer item, a constructed response item. Write down the time that the clock shows. And again, you might want students to be able to do this particular skill, but that is not what was indicated in the objective. The objective indicated that the students would state the time, say the time, right? Writing down time and writing it down in words like 1:50 o'clock or 1:50, that requires a level of formatting and a level of writing that they may or may not have before they learn the skill of telling you what time it is. So this is not a good item for that reason. Now, another reason why this is a bad item, if somebody were to show this to me, even without the objective, is that it doesn't indicate, it needs more information. It doesn't indicate how they want that time communicated. Do they want the entire thing written out, or can I write it with just a 1:50? or do I have to write out the words 1 and 50? That would be important. So I would need those directions. Here's another related item. Draw the hour and minute hands on the clock to show 2:10. Well, this might actually be an okay objective. However, it doesn't measure what you wanted the students to be able to do, which is to state the time. There's a big difference between drawing the hands on a clock and looking at a clock with hands and being able to tell the time. One real obvious issue is that they're going to have to know not only what the smaller and larger hands mean, what they represent, but also how to actually do that. I mean, that's a motor skill right there that goes beyond stating time. So I would have an issue with this item in terms of its alignment with the outcome. So here's a multiple choice item. What time does the clock show? If you look at this item and you ask yourself, okay, does it measure the objective, specifically stating the time? No, although you are identifying the time when the time is written out in time notation. But if I were to ask you what's wrong with this item, just in terms of, okay, so let's pretend for a minute that it actually does align with the objective, maybe a revised objective that is identify the time. So you look at this and you think, well, there are a few items though, right? They should be ordered. The choices should be ordered in some logical order, just because it draws attention to the fact that the correct answer is probably somewhere in the middle. So there's no reason why you couldn't just list them out from earliest to latest. Also, choice D is an obvious incorrect answer. And even though it relates to the numbers that the hands are pointing to, it's obviously incorrect. And so there's no reason to have something that's that obvious. It's an immediate, thing that you can eliminate. So I would ask you if this were an item that were shown to you on the exam, and there wasn't a question about whether or not it aligned well with the stated objective, but just what's wrong with this item, you would have to rely on the guidelines or the rules for good objectives writing in order to make that one a more effective item. Similarly, here's a true-false item that I could ask you, well, what's wrong with this true-false item? And you could look at that and say, well, it doesn't have, there isn't a correct answer. It could be true, but it could also not be true. So more information would be needed on that true-false item. Also, and again, not to belabor this point, but it doesn't really measure the stated objective. Students aren't asked to state the time. In this case, they're asked to be able to identify the time and then determine whether or not that would be a time that might be in a category of time that we have in our day called morning. And it may seem obvious, but that is not the skill that is indicated in the objective. And finally, we have a slide that presents a matching item. And if you look at this matching item, it might be hard to read. I'll read you the directions. It says match the letter of each analog clock to a digital clock based on the time shown. So there are a few obvious items with the matching that are problematic. First of all, as you probably could identify, you should have more choices to match than actual, than are presented, because otherwise, just by process of elimination, at least one of them might be able to be guessed if the learners weren't certain about it. Also, I would say that the directions would need to indicate that if there were more clocks than, more analog clocks than digital. I might point out, it might be important to point out to the learners the difference between an analog and a digital clock, which ones you're talking about, possibly. It might also be of value, I think it would, to indicate that the hour hands are shown in green and the minute hand is shown in red. It might not be completely obvious that they're different lengths, so that might be an important addition to this item. So you're going to have to use common sense somewhat when you assess the items, and then you're also going to have to apply the basic rules, which is the most obvious problem with this item is that it's a matching item and there are the same number of items to the ones being matched, and that is does not follow good rules. Also, on the digital clocks on the right hand side of the screen, it might be somewhat beneficial to have the items, all of them listed in some order, the order being maybe from earliest to latest in the day, that kind of thing. Also, it might also be important to point out that you're asking them to match AMs and PMs as well. And because the font is pretty small, they might not pick up on the fact that both clocks indicate whether or not it's AM or PM. So that's what you need to focus on. Let's go back to the objectives here. The only items that are going to be on the exam are, first of all, you should edit poorly worded assessment directions. And again, those will likely be just included as part of overall assessment items that you're going to have to examine and revise as needed. You'll also have to edit poorly constructed items and then write items when I give you a specific learning objective. You'll have to write them. And again, I cannot emphasize this enough. In addition to following the rules, those items must measure clearly what the objective indicates. So that's it. Those are the 3 objectives that are going to be measured. If you have any questions about anything in this brief review or any of the practice items, don't forget to ask them in the blog here. Go ahead and post them for everybody to see, and then when I respond, everybody else will be able to read what the response is. And of course, you can always email me as well if there's something specific that I didn't address that you need more clarity on. I'm very happy to do that as well. But good luck, and don't forget to complete the exam before midnight on Sunday. It'll be available starting Friday morning.